I never thought my own family would betray me like this. My name is Elena Marsh, and until 3 weeks ago, I believed I lived in a loving home with people who cared about me. I was 22, fresh out of college with a degree in literature, and dreams of becoming a writer. Those dreams died the moment my stepfather, Richard, sat me down in our cramped living room and told me about the arrangement. My mother, Sarah, couldn't even look at me as Richard explained how they'd fallen behind on their mortgage payments, how the bank was threatening foreclosure, and how they'd found a solution to all their problems. That solution was me. They had apparently been in contact with someone who was willing to pay their debts in exchange for my hand in marriage. The amount was staggering, $5 million, enough to clear their debts and leave them comfortable for life. "You don't understand, Elena," Richard said, his voice cold and calculating. "This isn't a request. The papers are already signed. Alexander Blackwood has already transferred the money." My blood ran cold at the mention of that name. Everyone knew about Alexander Blackwood, the mysterious billionaire, who owned half the city's real estate and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in business. Rumors swirled about his personal life, none of them good. My mother finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "We didn't have a choice, Elena. We would have lost everything." I stared at her in disbelief. The woman who had raised me, who had tucked me in at night and helped me with homework, had literally sold me to a stranger. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound ever could. I spent that night packing my few belongings, tears streaming down my face as I tried to process what was happening to me. By morning, a black luxury car would arrive to take me to my new life with a man I'd never met, in a world I'd never wanted to enter. My family had traded my freedom for their financial security, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Chapter 2. Meeting the Beast. The ride to Alexander Blackwood's estate felt like a journey to my execution. The driver, a stern-looking man in his 50s, didn't speak a single word during the hour-long drive through increasingly affluent neighborhoods. My hands trembled as I clutched my single suitcase, containing everything I owned in the world. The landscape outside gradually shifted from modest suburban homes to sprawling mansions, each more intimidating than the last. When we finally arrived at the Blackwood estate, I felt my breath catch in my throat. The property was massive, a modern architectural masterpiece of glass, steel and stone that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. Manicured gardens surrounded the house, and I could see a glimpse of what looked like a private lake in the distance. This wasn't just wealth. This was the kind of power that could reshape entire cities. A woman in a crisp uniform met me at the entrance. "Miss Marsh," she said with professional courtesy. "I'm Mrs. Chen, the house manager. Mr. Blackwood is waiting for you in his study." She led me through corridors lined with expensive artwork and sculptures that probably cost more than my family's house. Everything about this place screamed money and power, but there was something cold about it too, like a beautiful prison. The study doors were massive oak panels that Mrs. Chen opened with what seemed like reverence. "Mr. Blackwood, Miss Marsh has arrived." And then I saw him. Alexander Blackwood stood with his back to me, looking out floor-to-ceiling windows at his property. He was tall, easily 6'3", with broad shoulders that filled out his perfectly tailored black suit. His dark hair was styled impeccably, and even from behind, he exuded an aura of absolute control. When he turned around, I was struck by how young he looked, maybe early 30s, and devastatingly handsome in a way that seemed almost dangerous. His green eyes were sharp and calculating, studying me with an intensity that made me feel like prey being evaluated by a predator. "So," he said, his voice deep and controlled, "you're the girl they sold me." Chapter 3. The contract. Alexander's words hit me like a physical blow. The casual way he said "the girl they sold me" made my stomach churn. I forced myself to stand straighter, refusing to let him see how terrified I was. "My name is Elena," I said, proud that my voice didn't shake despite the fear coursing through my veins, "and I'm not property to be bought and sold." He raised an eyebrow, and I caught what might have been amusement in his expression. "Yet here you are," he replied coolly. He moved to his desk, a massive piece of furniture made from what looked like a single piece of dark wood, and picked up a leather folder. "Your stepfather was quite eager to close this deal. Apparently, you were worth $5 million to him." The reminder of my family's betrayal sent a fresh wave of pain through my chest. I watched as Alexander opened the folder and pulled out several documents. "These are the terms of our arrangement," he continued, his tone businesslike. "You will live here as my wife. You will attend social functions as required. You will not embarrass me or my reputation in any way." He looked up at me with those piercing green eyes. "In return, you'll have everything money can buy." I found my voice again, anger beginning to override fear. "And what if I refuse? What if I just walk out that door right now?" Alexander's smile was cold and predatory. "Then your family loses their house. Your stepfather goes to prison for the gambling debts he failed to mention. And your mother loses her job at the company I happen to own." The blood drained from my face as I realized the extent of his control over my life. "You've done your research," I whispered. He nodded matter-of-factly. "I always know exactly what I'm buying, Elena. Your family came to me desperate, and I provided a solution that benefits everyone." He set the papers down on the desk. "Well, almost everyone." The way he said it made me wonder if there was more to this arrangement than he was letting on. I realized I was trapped completely. My family had not only sold me, they had made it impossible for me to escape without destroying them in the process. Alexander Blackwood held all the cards, and we both knew it. Chapter 4. The Golden Cage. My new room was larger than our entire downstairs back home. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the estate's gardens and the lake beyond. The bed was enormous, dressed in silk sheets that probably cost more than my college tuition. A walk-in closet, the size of my old bedroom, was filled with designer clothing in my exact size. Alexander had indeed done his research thoroughly. Mrs. Chen gave me a tour of the house, explaining the rules and expectations. "Mr. Blackwood values privacy and order," she explained as we walked through room after room of luxury. "He eats breakfast at 7 sharp, dinner at 8. He works from his study most days and doesn't like to be disturbed unless it's urgent." She paused at the entrance to what looked like a library. "He thought you might appreciate this room," I gasped as we entered. The library was 3 stories tall, with spiral staircases leading to different levels and thousands of books lining the walls. Reading nooks with comfortable chairs were scattered throughout, and natural light flooded in from skylights above. It was the most beautiful room I'd ever seen. "He said you studied literature," Mrs. Chen added quietly. "He wanted you to feel ... comfortable." This small gesture of consideration confused me. The man who had bought me like property had created a paradise for a book lover. I ran my fingers along the spines of classic novels, contemporary fiction, poetry collections, everything a literature graduate could dream of. Why would someone so cold and calculating care about my comfort? That evening, I was expected to join Alexander for dinner. The dining room was formal and intimidating, with a table that could easily seat 20 people. He sat at the head, I at his right, and the distance between us felt both vast and suffocating. "How do you find your accommodations?" he asked as staff served our meal with silent efficiency. "They're adequate," I replied, not wanting to give him the satisfaction of knowing how much the library had affected me. He smiled slightly. "I'm glad you approve of the library. I was told you have aspirations of becoming a writer." The fact that he knew about my dreams felt like another invasion, another way he had studied and cataloged me before this transaction. Chapter 5. Unexpected depths. Days passed in a strange routine. Alexander left early for his office in the city, returning in the evenings for our silent dinners. I spent most of my time in the library, reading voraciously and trying to escape into other worlds. Sometimes I caught staff members watching me with what seemed like sympathy, but none of them dared speak about their employer or my situation. One afternoon, while exploring a section of philosophy books, I discovered something unexpected. Hidden between volumes of Kant and Nietzsche was a small worn notebook. My curiosity overrode my caution, and I opened it carefully. The pages were filled with handwriting, not notes about philosophy, but what appeared to be poetry. The writing was raw, emotional, and spoke of loneliness, isolation, and a deep yearning for genuine connection. The signature at the bottom of each poem made my hands shake. A Blackwood. I quickly replaced the notebook, my mind reeling. The cold, calculating businessman who had purchased me like a commodity wrote poetry about loneliness and longing. It didn't fit with anything I thought I knew about him, and it left me more confused than ever about who Alexander Blackwood really was. That evening at dinner, I found myself studying him more carefully. The way his jaw tightened when he thought no one was looking, how his eyes sometimes seemed distant and sad when he stared out the window. "Is something wrong?" he asked, noticing my scrutiny. I shook my head quickly, but couldn't stop thinking about those poems. "Tell me about your writing," he said suddenly, surprising me. "What kind of stories do you want to tell?" It was the first personal question he'd asked me since I'd arrived. I hesitated, unsure if this was genuine interest or just another way to gather information about me. "I write about people who feel trapped," I said finally. "About finding freedom even when the world seems determined to cage you." Something flickered in his eyes at my words, but his expression remained controlled. "Freedom," he repeated thoughtfully, "an interesting concept. Some people think they want it, but they have no idea what to do with it when they get it." The way he said it made me wonder if he was speaking from experience. Chapter 6. Cracks in the Facade. A week later, Alexander announced that we would be attending a charity gala together. My first public appearance as his wife. Mrs. Chen brought in a team of stylists who transformed me into someone I barely recognized. The emerald green dress they selected was stunning, but felt like a costume for a role I never auditioned for. "You look beautiful," Alexander said when he saw me, but his tone was matter-of-fact rather than affectionate. The gala was held at the city's most exclusive hotel, and I quickly realized that every person there knew exactly who I was and why I was with Alexander. The looks I received ranged from pitying to judgmental, but everyone maintained the polite facade that high society demanded. Alexander kept me close, his hand on my lower back as he introduced me with practiced charm. "So this is the famous Elena," said a woman dripping in diamonds and disdain. "How refreshing to see Alexander finally settle down." Her tone made it clear she knew the true nature of our arrangement. I felt my cheeks burn with shame, but Alexander's grip on my back tightened slightly. Whether in warning or support, I couldn't tell. During a moment when Alexander was pulled into a business conversation, I stepped onto the hotel's terrace for air. The night was cool, and the city lights spread out below like a carpet of stars. I was surprised when Alexander appeared beside me a few minutes later. "They're all vultures," he said quietly, his usual controlled demeanor cracking slightly. "Every single person in that room would sell their soul for the right price." "Is that what you think I did?" I asked, turning to face him. "Sold my soul?" He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "No," he said finally. "I think your family sold yours." The admission hung between us, and for a moment, I saw past the cold exterior to something that looked almost like regret. We stood in silence for a while, both lost in our own thoughts. When we finally went back inside, something had shifted between us, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Chapter 7. The revelation. 2 weeks after the gala, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was in the library when I accidentally knocked over a small stack of books, and several photographs fell out from between the pages. As I gathered them up, my blood ran cold. The photos showed a young woman who looked remarkably like me, same dark hair, similar features, even a similar smile. She was laughing in some of the pictures, clearly happy and in love with whoever was taking the photos. At the bottom of one photo, in handwriting I now recognized, was written, "My darling Isabella, forever in my heart." The date was from 5 years ago. My hands shook as I stared at the images. Alexander had been in love with someone who looked like me, and now I understood why he had agreed to this arrangement. I wasn't his wife, I was a replacement for someone he had lost. I heard footsteps and quickly tried to hide the photos, but it was too late. Alexander stood in the doorway, his face pale as he saw what I had discovered. "You weren't supposed to find those," he said quietly, his usual composure completely gone. I held up the photos with trembling hands. "Who was she?" I demanded. "Who was Isabella?" Alexander's shoulders sagged as he came into the room, suddenly looking older than his 32 years. "My fiancée," he said simply. "She died in a car accident 3 years ago." He reached for the photos, and I let him take them, watching as he stared at the image with obvious pain. When your stepfather contacted me with your photo, I thought maybe I could have some piece of her back. The truth hit me like a physical blow. You didn't buy a wife, I whispered in horror. You bought a replacement, a substitute for the woman you lost. Alexander's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Does it matter? He asked. The result is the same. Your family is safe, you're provided for, and I get what I need. What you need is therapy, not a human replacement. I snapped, my anger finally overriding my fear. I'm not her, Alexander. I'm not Isabella, and I never will be. His green eyes flashed with something dangerous. Don't you think I know that? He said, his voice rough with emotion. Don't you think I'm reminded of that every single day? Chapter 8. Understanding the monster. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the pain I'd seen in Alexander's eyes, the raw grief that he kept hidden behind his cold facade. As much as I wanted to hate him for what he'd done to me, I was beginning to understand that he was as trapped as I was, imprisoned by his own grief and desperate need to hold on to something that was gone forever. I found myself wandering the house in the early hours of the morning, and was surprised to see light coming from under his study door. I hesitated for a long moment before knocking softly. Come in, came his tired voice. Alexander sat behind his desk, still dressed in his clothes from dinner, with an empty bottle of whiskey and the photos of Isabella spread out before him. You should be sleeping, he said without looking up. I stepped into the room, noting how vulnerable he looked in the dim lamplight. So should you. I moved closer to the desk, and he finally raised his eyes to meet mine. They were red-rimmed and filled with a pain so deep it took my breath away. She would have hated what I've become, he said quietly. Tell me about her, I said, surprising both of us. Alexander was quiet for so long, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. Isabella was light, pure goodness in a world full of darkness. She saw the best in everyone, even me. His voice broke slightly. She used to say I had a good heart buried under all the armor I wore for business. As he talked about Isabella, I began to see a different man. Not the cold, calculating billionaire who had bought me, but someone who had loved deeply and lost everything that mattered to him. She sounds wonderful, I said honestly. Alexander nodded, then looked at me with something like surprise. Why aren't you running away screaming? Most people would be horrified by what I've done. Maybe I am horrified, I admitted. But I'm also beginning to understand that you're not the monster I thought you were. You're just a man who's been destroyed by grief and doesn't know how to heal. Alexander stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. A crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. Chapter 9. An unexpected alliance. The morning after our conversation, everything felt different. Alexander was still formal and distant, but there was less hostility in his manner. During breakfast, he surprised me by asking, "Would you like to visit the city today? There's a bookstore I think you might enjoy." It was the first time he'd offered me any kind of freedom since I'd arrived. The bookstore was a small, independent shop, tucked between two larger businesses. It was exactly the kind of place I would have chosen myself, cramped, cluttered, and filled with literary treasures. Isabella loved this place, Alexander said quietly as we browsed the shelves. She said it had soul. I watched him run his fingers along the spines of books, and realized this visit was as much about his memories as it was about my interests. We spent 2 hours in the store, and for the first time since our arrangement began, I felt almost normal. Alexander bought me a stack of books, including a beautiful leather-bound journal. For your writing, he explained when I looked at him questioningly. Isabella always said writers needed to capture their thoughts before they flew away. It was a thoughtful gesture that confused and touched me in equal measure. On the drive back to the estate, Alexander spoke suddenly. I know this isn't the life you wanted, Elena. I know what I've taken from you. I turned to study his profile as he drove, noting the tension in his jaw. But I also know I can't let you go, not yet. The honesty in his admission was both frightening and oddly comforting. At least now we were acknowledging the reality of our situation. What would it take, I asked quietly, for you to let me go? Alexander was silent for a long time. I don't know, he finally admitted. Isabella was my anchor to humanity. Without her, I feel like I'm drowning. You. You remind me what it feels like to breathe again." The vulnerability in his voice made my chest tighten. This man was as much a prisoner as I was, trapped by his inability to let go of the past. That evening, I began writing in the journal he'd given me. Not the stories I'd always dreamed of telling, but the truth of my situation, the complex emotions of living with a man who was both my captor and, increasingly, someone I was beginning to understand and even sympathize with. Chapter 10. The turning point. 3 months into our arrangement, everything changed during what should have been a routine evening. Alexander had been working late in his study when I heard a crash and a cry of pain. I rushed to find him collapsed on the floor, his face pale and sweating, clutching his chest. "Heart," he gasped. "Pills. Desk drawer." My hands shook as I found his medication and called for an ambulance. At the hospital, I sat in the waiting room while doctors worked to stabilize him. Mrs. Chen arrived with lawyers and other business associates, all of them treating me like an inconvenience. "You should go home," one of the lawyers told me. "This doesn't concern you." But I couldn't leave. Despite everything, the thought of Alexander dying terrified me in a way I hadn't expected. When I was finally allowed to see him, Alexander looked fragile in the hospital bed, hooked up to monitors and 4 lines. "You came," he said, his voice weak with surprise. "Did you think I wouldn't?" I asked, settling into the chair beside his bed. He studied my face with those piercing green eyes. Most people would have seen this as their chance to escape. The thought occurred to me, I admitted, but I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you and I wasn't here. Alexander's expression softened in a way I'd never seen before. "Why?" he asked simply. I thought about my answer carefully, because despite everything you've done, I think you're a good person who's been lost in grief. And because I care about what happens to you. The admission surprised me as much as it did him. Somewhere in the past months, my feelings toward Alexander had evolved from fear and hatred to something more complex. I didn't love him. I wasn't sure I could ever love someone who had bought me like property, but I had come to care about his well-being and even understand his pain. Alexander reached out and took my hand, his touch gentle for the first time since I'd known him. "Elena," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something. The arrangement with your family. It wasn't just about you looking like Isabella." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" He squeezed my hand lightly. "Your stepfather didn't just come to me for money. He came because he knew about Isabella, knew I was vulnerable, and he knew you would be perfect bait." Chapter 11. The truth revealed. The revelation that my family had specifically targeted Alexander left me reeling. "What are you saying?" I whispered, though part of me already knew. Alexander's grip on my hand tightened. "Your stepfather researched me thoroughly. He knew about Isabella, knew what she looked like, knew that I would be unable to resist someone who reminded me of her. This wasn't desperation, Elena. It was calculated manipulation." I felt sick as the pieces fell into place. Richard's suddenly detailed knowledge of Alexander's business, the way he'd been so confident the deal would go through, even the timing of their approach, it had all been planned. "He used my grief against me," Alexander continued, "and he used your love for your family against you. We were both played. The anger that filled me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. My own family had not only sold me a bid, they had researched and targeted a grieving man specifically to exploit his vulnerability." "How long have you known?" I asked through gritted teeth. Alexander looked ashamed. "I suspected from the beginning, but I was too selfish to care. I wanted what he was offering, regardless of his motives. And now," I challenged, "now that you know we were both victims of their scheme." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring at our joined hands. "Now I realize I've been as much of a monster as they are. I've kept you prisoner because of my own pain, when you're just as much a victim as I am." The beeping of his heart monitor filled the silence between us. "What happens now?" I asked finally. Alexander met my eyes, and I saw a clarity there that hadn't been present before. "Now I give you what I should have given you from the beginning, a choice. When I'm released from here, you can leave. I'll make sure you have everything you need to start over anywhere you want. Your family's debts will remain paid, but you'll be free." The offer I'd dreamed of was finally being made, but strangely, I felt no immediate relief. "And what about you?" I asked. Alexander smiled sadly. "I'll figure out how to live with my grief without dragging innocent people into it." He paused. "I'm sorry, Elena, for all of it. You deserved so much better." As I sat there holding the hand of the man who had bought me, I realized that my feelings had become far more complicated than I'd ever expected. Chapter 12. The choice. Alexander was released from the hospital a week later, and true to his word, he had papers drawn up that would grant me complete freedom. He also had Mrs. Chen prepare a substantial financial settlement that would allow me to start over anywhere in the world. As I stared at the documents on his desk, I felt a strange mixture of relief and unexpected sadness. "Where will you go?" he asked as I reviewed the papers. I looked up to find him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've spent so long focused on getting free that I never really thought about what I'd do once I had that freedom." Alexander nodded, understanding. Freedom can be overwhelming when you've lived without it for so long. Over the past week, I'd done a lot of thinking. About Alexander, about myself, about what I'd learned during my time in this golden cage. The man sitting across from me now was different from the cold, calculating businessman who had bought me 6 months ago. His near-death experience had cracked something open in him, allowed the man Isabella had fallen in love with to emerge from beneath layers of grief and guilt. "I have a proposition," I said suddenly, surprising both of us. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to suggest would change everything. "What if I stayed? Not as your purchased wife, not as Isabella's replacement, but as Elena, as myself." Alexander's eyes widened. "Elena, you don't owe me anything. You don't need to. I'm not staying out of obligation," I interrupted. "I'm staying because I want to. Because I think we could build something real together, if we both chose it freely." I gestured to the papers. "These documents prove you're willing to let me go, which means if I stay, it's my choice." Alexander studied my face intently. "Are you sure? After everything I've put you through?" I smiled, feeling truly free for the first time in months. "I'm sure. But this time, we do things right. We start over, get to know each other as the people we really are, not the roles we were forced into." Alexander's answering smile was the first genuine one I'd seen from him. "I'd like that," he said softly. "I'd like that very much." He reached across the desk and took my hand, not as my owner, but as a man asking for a chance at something real. 6 months later, I was writing the final chapter of my first novel, a story about two people who found love in the most unexpected circumstances, who learned that sometimes the greatest freedom comes not from escaping your cage, but from choosing to open the door and walk through it together. Alexander had proposed again, properly this time, and I had said yes because I wanted to, not because I had to. Our story began with betrayal and manipulation, but it became something beautiful when we chose to write our own ending.